Hello. Whoa, that's something. Hey, we're going to begin. I have an extensive introduction of Mark Hiskes that I'd like to make for those of you that are unfamiliar with him. They're still rolling in, Mark. We'll probably wind up having to set up chairs.
Man.
You're
Wow.
you're very popular. Mark was a high school English teacher for 40. Is it correct? 40 years. 33 of them. I'm just guessing.
Here, Holland, yeah.
Yeah, in Holland at Holland Christian, and retired a couple years ago. And in his retirement is busier than ever. So Mark's going to talk about literary homesickness, and I'm going to let him take it away. But I see him in the picture. It took me a while. At first, I was focused on the dogs.
Yeah.
But I see you're in there.
Just so you know, folks, that is not my family up there. But I will explain it. There's a lot of wisdom in this room about the concept of home. And so I in no way want to sort of take over here. I'd love to hear feedback along the way, comments, questions on your thinking about home. I'm not sure I'll teach anything new, because I think mostly what literature does and mostly what even pastors do with incredible sermons like today just remind us of things we've always known, but just do so in a kind of fresh way. And so maybe I can remind you of a few things today about literary homesickness, another way of saying the literary longing for home that's so prevalent in so many pieces of literature. But I'm going to explain this picture first, because it was here that I first kind of learned something about home that I never quite realized. So for about on and off every other year for about 20 years, I would take students on a literary tour of New England, and I called it Walk to Walden. We'd end up staying in Concord, Massachusetts, and we would literally, on the last day, we'd walk to Walden Pond, which is about 2 miles away from our bed and breakfast. But it was Walk to Walden, but we always began it at this farm in Maine. And the farm is called Morrill Farm, Morrill Farm. And it's run by Pat and Larry Perron, two French-Canadian Catholics, extraordinary people. And Deb Freno, who lives there as well, not on the farm but nearby, is the sort of living historian. And what they would do for us, Calvin did this for a while, and one year I helped lead a Calvin tour, and that's how I learned about all of this stuff. This farm, which already was a very organically run farm, would host us for a weekend. And they would take everything in the farm, in the barn, in the house, and make it look like it was 1870. They'd cover up electric lights, they'd cover up switches, they'd bring lamps in, oil lamps and lanterns. They asked us to dress the part. Girls had to wear long dresses and long sleeves. Men, we got away with just kind of wearing a little more rugged clothes. We would go there, and the big fear of students was they weren't going to shower for 2 days. There was no indoor plumbing. There was, but they had an outhouse for us, and we all got used to that. We would milk cows. We would churn butter. We'd make ice cream by hand. We'd even work in the fields with farmers whose plow would be drawn by horses. They did everything as though it was 1870. The very first time I went was in the winter, and it struck me there that back in 1870, warmth and light hold people together. We'd gather during the day and the evening around a fireplace. I think actually it was a stove. You had to. Maine winters were brutal. I forget how we'd stay warm in the rooms. I don't remember how they pulled that off. But then at dinner, they'd have maybe 1 or 2 oil lamps in the dark, and everyone leaned in. this huge group, and it would even get bigger because on Saturday night they'd host a square dance, and all their friends from the town would come walking up. They'd all park their cars, halfway down the road, so no one would see those awful cars. They'd come walking in dressed, and some of them had their guitars, but warmth pulled us together, and light drew us in. The light reminded me of growing up on Mission Avenue, where my folks, who were Depression era people, would, on winter nights, every light in our house was out, except above the kitchen table. And I have a vivid memory of that in my head. Of the 9 of us, my sister was out of the house before I was even alert enough to know I had an older sister. But 9 of us would gather around that table. And so this farm taught me that I think 2 of the essentials in a non-metaphorical way for home were warmth and light. Not a metaphor, warmth and light simply drew us in. When electricity came, suddenly we could all fill different parts of the house. When forced air was invented, we could all go to our own corners. And now with electronic technology the way it is, we can all be separate very easily. But for me, home became that place of warmth and light, and I think the sense of peace that comes with that. I just want to ask at the outset, what would you add to that? What words? Mine are warmth and light and peace. What would you add to that picture of home at its best for you? Pardon? Laughter, comfort, fellowship, food. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that'll be mentioned in here at one point. All these things we associate with, and stories. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And you'd have time. I mean, as one person knitted or darned socks, as my mom did, you could talk and share stories. Yeah. Right. So that's what I want you to think about. Home as that place of warmth and light and fellowship and comfort and peace. And so as I dug into this idea, you know how you sometimes come up with a title before you actually know what it is you're going to say? Literary homesickness. I had one idea, but the more I dug into it, the more I realized there really are, I think, at least 3 forms of literary homesickness, literary longing for home. And the first is the most literal, the longing for a home or a return to a home, that literal longing for home. And the book that I kept coming back to sort of represent that the best is one I'm guessing some of you know, or maybe most of you know, The Human Comedy by William Saroyan. Came out in 1943. And one of the things that struck me as I was preparing this, a lot of the best talk of home comes during those awful times, like World War II. I mean, think how much great literature came out of that period and has come out since about that period. But so much of the best literature was about those things we're losing in the face of the chaos of the world. And so I want to just remind you of this. I don't know how much you know about this, but it's based on Homer's Odyssey. Homer, who was away at the Trojan, or not Homer, Odysseus, who was away at the Trojan Wars for 10 years, and then because he offended Poseidon by blinding the Cyclops, was condemned to take another 10 years to get home to his island of Ithaca, and his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. And so the whole narrative is about returning home. The Human Comedy is an echo of that. It involves a little town called Ithaca, New York. I'm not sure if it actually exists. Does it? It does. Okay. Pardon? Okay, gotcha. Okay. I taught this long ago. Maybe I knew that then. I'm not sure. So Ithaca does exist. So it's set in Ithaca, The main character is a young boy named Homer, and his little brother is Ulysses, the other name for Odysseus. Homer and Ulysses McCully. And Homer's first job is as a telegraph deliverer. He takes his bike and he delivers telegraphs. This is set during World War II. His oldest brother, Marcus, is in the war. You never meet him. His father, I believe, was killed in the war. Father's no longer with them. And Homer's job is to deliver telegraphs. One of the kinds of telegraphs he has to deliver, of course, is the ones to the families in this book, to the mothers who've lost a son in battle. I remember hearing from my grandma and my mom very well about Uncle Clarence, who was shot down and never found, about Uncle Rich, who came back shell-shocked, about my dad, who was there for 3 years. And then, all of that time, just wondering, will our home ever be the same again? And inevitably, he has to deliver the telegraph to his own mother, that Marcus hasn't made it. But I want to just share with you, and I'm not going to read from the book so much as sort of summarize it, but even from the start, the sign outside of Ithaca says this: Ithaca, California. East, west, home is best. Welcome, stranger. Anybody want to recommend that for Ottawa County? Instead of Freedom Rings? Maybe, or Holland, Michigan. East, west, home is best. Welcome, stranger. And the book ends, and I don't want to spoil it for you, but the book ends with Homer getting the telegraph that his superior says, I'll deliver this one, because Homer knows what it's about. But on that same day he's going to deliver that telegraph, 3 soldiers show up. And one of them is on crutches and limping. And his name is Toby George. And Toby was Homer's brother Marcus's best friend in the war. And Toby knows everything there is to know about Ithaca, California, and everything about the McCully family. And while Marcus hasn't returned, he shows up at the door when the telegraph does. And they welcome him in. All their tragic, all the horrible news they get, here's a guy who can tell them all they need to know about their lost son. And it's clear they're going to adopt him into the family because he doesn't have a family of his own. Just a beautiful story about how home is a place where you welcome people in. It made me think of Angel and Janelle and Samuel down in Juarez. And I think that's exactly what they are trying to do here at Third Church. These are people returning, leaving tragedies, leaving homes that are unlivable now for one reason or another. And Angel and Janelle and now Third Church is saying to them, welcome, stranger. East, west, home is best. Welcome, stranger. And TRC has kind of become that for them. So that first kind of literary homelessness, a literal absence of home, which then got me thinking about another classic, also set in California, Salinas Valley. And you know this one, George and Lenny of Mice and Men. A tragic story. By the way, this is called a human comedy. Even though it ends tragically, it's a comedy not in a ha-ha sort of way, but in an affirmation of life. It affirms life. How do you handle tragedy? You welcome more people in. So it's a comedy in that sense. This one is a true tragedy, though. You may remember George and Lenny are 2 migrant workers looking for work. They go from ranch to ranch. Lenny is the big, strong, slow, mentally challenged one. George is small and sharp and smart, and they're like brothers to each other. George pretends to hate having to put up with all of Lenny's nonsense all the time, and Lenny is just devoted to George. No matter where they go, though, Lenny ends up making a mistake. He loves soft things, and the problem is he starts petting things like puppies, and they die. And the book opens with him having something in his pocket, and what he has in his pocket is a dead mouse. And he just loved the softness. And George scolds him for it and then throws it into the woods. And then we hear this first time, what will be repeated 3 or 4 times throughout the book, is Lenny's hope for a home. Do you remember this? I'll read it to you, part of it, because it's sort of repeated throughout, and then it's repeated again at the very end of the story. So Lenny is messed up. George is mad at him, and then Lenny, to sort of get back in his good graces, says, George, tell me like you done before. Tell you what? About the rabbits. George snapped, you ain't going to put nothing over on me. Lenny pleaded, come on, George. Tell me, please, George, like you done before. You get a kick out of that, don't you? All right, Lenny, I'll tell you, and then we'll eat our supper. George's voice became deeper. He repeated his words rhythmically as though he had said them many times before. Guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. They got no family. They don't belong no place. They come to a ranch and work up a stake, and then they go into a town and blow their stake, and the first thing you know, they're pounding their tail on some other ranch. They ain't got nothing to look ahead to. Lenny was delighted. That's it. Now, tell how it is with us. George went on. With us, it ain't like that. We got a future. We got somebody to talk to that gives a damn about us. We don't have to sit in no bar room blowing in our jack just because we got no place else to go. If them other guys gets in jail, they can rot for anybody gives a damn, but not us. And Lenny broke in. But not us. And why? Because I got you to look after me, and you got me to look after you, and that's why. He laughed delightedly. Go on now, George. You got it by heart. You can do it yourself. No, you. I forget some of the things. Tell about how it's going to be. Okay, someday we're going to get the jack together, and we're going to have a little house and a couple of acres and a cow and some pigs and live off the fat of the land, Lenny shouted, and have rabbits. Go on, George, tell about what we're going to have in the garden, and about the rabbits in the cages, and about the rain in the winter in the stove, and how thick the cream is on the milk like you can't hardly cut it. Tell about that, George. Why don't you do it yourself? You know all of it. No, you tell it. It ain't the same if I tell it. Go on, George, how I get to tend the rabbits. Well, said George, we'll have a big vegetable patch and a rabbit hutch and chickens, and when it rains in winter, we'll just say to hell with going to work, and we'll build up a fire in the stove and sit around it and listen to the rain coming down on the roof. Nuts. Took out his pocket knife. I ain't got no time for this. And that's repeated several times in the story. But it is a tragedy, because Steinbeck, who sets this story during the 30s, the Great Depression, doesn't allow them to find that home. I won't spoil the ending. You should read it again. It's an incredibly sad ending to the story, but they never do quite find the home that they long for. Which then reminded me of something a little closer to our story today, American Dirt by Janine Cummins, in which she describes a similar setting, a mother and her son. Lydia is the mother, and her son is Luca. And they are fleeing to the United States because at a birthday party for Luca's mother, for Luca's grandmother, Lydia's mother, a cartel has come in and murdered the father because he's a newspaper reporter and they didn't like what he was writing. They murdered the father, they murdered the grandmother, They're looking for the mother and the son who just managed to get away. And so they're fleeing to the north where they hope to find something resembling the home they've just fled from. Along the way, they are joined by a number of people, but two in particular, two girls, Soledad and Rebecca, who sort of become adopted daughters. Lydia thinks maybe traveling as four instead of the two might throw the people off who are pursuing her and trying to kill her and her son. And so they welcome these two young sisters in. Soledad has been raped and is pregnant. Their father has been badly beaten up and has told them, you have to run. You have to run north. And so these four are fleeing to the north, to the United States. And I just want to pick up in a passage where we are reminded very much of George and Lenny, but also of stories that we hear every day here in Holland, Michigan. That Lydia and Luca will travel with Soledad and Rebecca for as long as possible has not been detailed aloud. Yet it's an arrangement all four of them intuitively understand. So much has happened that each hour of this journey feels like a year. But there's something more than that. It's the bond of trauma, the bond of sharing an indescribable experience together. Whatever happens, no one else in their lives will ever fully comprehend the ordeal of this pilgrimage, the characters they've met, the fear that travels with them, the grief and fatigue that eat at them, their collective determination to keep pressing north. It solders them together so that they feel like an almost family now. It's also true that selfishly, strategically, Lydia, the mother, hopes the addition of two extra people to their traveling party might serve as an extra layer of camouflage, might confuse anyone who, at first glance, suspects she might be the dead reporter's missing widow. Before sleep, Lydia closes the ugliest box in her mind and instead allows herself to think forward to Estados Unidos. Instead of Denver, she thinks of a little white house in the desert with thick adobe walls. She's seen pictures of Arizona, cactuses and lizards, the ruddy red landscape and hot blue sky. She pictures Luca with a clean backpack and a haircut, getting on a big yellow school bus and waving at her from the window. And then she conjures a third bedroom in that house for the sisters. Soledad's new baby, perhaps a little girl, the smell of diapers, a bath in the kitchen sink. And that's what keeps her going. The hope of that. I've heard Angel that she says somewhere else that there will be no fear when they get to the United States. I've heard Angel talk about how sometimes his brother Samuel tries to temper that and say, you will have struggles still. You will still have fear. But it's the dream, just like George and Lenny, that they carry with them of home, an actual home where they can have warmth and light and peace and safety and some sort of new fellowship that they had, but they have no more. There are other books, I think, that probably echo that. And so I'm going to just ask, does something else come to mind where you'd say, yeah, here's another novel that does that, or another book that I'm reminded of? Because I know there are others, but go ahead, Bruce. There. What's the poem that's from? I forget. It's a long one. Yeah, the Death of the Hired Man. That's right. Thank you. Yeah, good. Buechner talks a little bit about this. We have a few Buechner fans besides Jeff in here, I think. This is Beyond Words, a collection of 365 words for daily readings. This is the word homelessness as he defines it. Kind of echoes this and also where we're going to go next. We lie in our beds in the dark. There's a picture of the children on the bureau. A patch of moonlight catches our clothes thrown in over the back of a chair. We can hear the faint rumble of the furnace in the cellar. We're surrounded by the reassurance of the familiar. When the weather's bad, we have shelter. When things are bad in our lives, we have a place where we can retreat to lick our wounds while tens of thousands of people, many of them children, wander the dark streets in search of some corner to lie down in out of the wind. Yet we are homeless, even so, in the sense of having homes, but not really being at home in them. To be really at home is to be really at peace. And there can be no real peace for us until there is some measure of real peace for all of us. When we close our eyes to the deep needs of other people, whether they live on the streets or under our own roof, and when we close our eyes to our own deep need to reach out to them, we can never be fully at home anywhere. Imagine if all Americans took that attitude toward migrants coming to our country. Home, that place that all of us want to go to with warmth and light. But the first one is the first theme in literature, I think, is people who crave that home but don't have an actual home. The second kind of literary homesickness, I think, is a little closer to all of us, if I can say that. It's when the home we inhabit has been broken in some way by estrangement, by abuse, by death, by tragedy of another kind. And that's very prevalent in literature. I think there are countless books. Our own Lorna Cook has written a book. I think a couple of her novels are in the library and are being featured this time, right? Because she's written about those kind of home situations. Ann Tyler comes to mind, Barbara Kingsolver, David James Duncan. There are all kinds of authors who talk about this kind of broken home theme. But the one I kept coming back to is one I think several people here know, by Marilynne Robinson. John Hesselink was a friend of hers and a huge fan of hers. And the book is Home. And she got a Pulitzer Prize for her first novel, or second novel, Gilead. And this one is just as good. And yet it's not quite as comforting because there's a lot going on. It is set in Gilead, where all her novels are, in the 1950s, at the rise, Gilead, Iowa, by the way, at the rise of the civil rights movement. So again, a time of tension. An estranged son, so echoes of Odysseus, an estranged son returns home after being gone for 20 years. His name is Jack. He's the family bad boy. He did some pretty awful things when he was young, some things with consequences for other people that are terrible. He's an alcoholic, and now he has done something that you'll discover is even harder for his family to understand. His father, in particular, he's had a relationship. He's fallen in love with a Black woman, and they've had a child together. Jack comes home to his father, Robert Boughton, Reverend Robert Boughton. He's a Presbyterian pastor, and he's getting old and is near death. And Jack, for whatever reason, needs to come home, needs to see his father. It has echoes of the prodigal son, but Jack isn't as sorry as the prodigal son, and Reverend Boughton isn't as willing to forgive everything as the father and the prodigal son. It's complicated, and that's what Marilynne Robinson brings out so well. This family is complicated. Glory, one of the sisters in the Boughton family, has returned home to live and sort of care for her dad. And so when Jack shows up, her big brother Jack, she is just thrilled. And she sort of serves as the kind of referee between these two. Every talk they have has the chance to blow up into something hurtful. It echoes to what Buechner says. There's no real peace in a home until there's peace for everyone. Reverend Boughton wakes up almost every night worried about his son Jack that he hasn't seen for 20 years, worried that he's going to be okay. Again, though, that the book just shows so beautifully how complex it is to how complex home is. Even when it's a good home by anyone's external sort of look. There are things going on there, though, that the people inside know. So she sort of shows us the good and the bad. And so number of places it talks about how home is where we experience grace, right? And in the Reverend Boughton's home, grace is talked about all the time. So here's Glory reflecting after Jack has just fallen off the wagon. He's gotten roaring drunk. He's contemplated very seriously committing suicide. He's gone through some of the necessary steps, and she finds him. Dresses, cleans him up, sobers him up, takes him back into the house before Dad knows anything that's going on. And so she says, how to announce the return of comfort and well-being except by cooking something fragrant? That is what her mother always did. At every calamity of any significance, she would fill the atmosphere of the house with the smell of cinnamon rolls or brownies or with chicken and dumplings. And it would mean this house has a soul that loves us all, no matter what. It would mean peace if they had fought and amnesty if they had been in trouble. It had meant you can come down to dinner now and no one will say a thing to bother you unless you've forgotten to wash your hands. And her father would offer the grace, inevitable with minor variations, thanking the Lord for all the wonderful faces he saw around his table. And so she does show us the beauty of home, the things that we can recognize well. But it's also a place where Robinson reflects, we want to flee. Kids want to flee. They can't wait to get out. So Glory's thinking, and here is the world, she thought, just as we left it. So she wakes up after that awful day and that meal where she's tried to patch things up. She wakes up the next morning. Here is the world, she thought, just as we left it. A hot white sky and a soft wind, a murmur among the trees, the treble rasp of a few cicadas. There were acorns in the road, some of them broken by passing cars. Chrysanthemums were coming into bloom. Yellowing squash vines swamped the vegetable gardens, and tomato plants hung from their stakes, depleted with bearing. Another summer in Gilead. Gilead, dreaming out its curse of sameness, somnolence. How could anyone want to live here? That was the question they asked one another out of their father's hearing. When they came back from college or from the world, why would anyone stay here? I'm thinking a few young people have said that about Holland, Michigan, right? What kinder place could there be on earth, she reflects. And why did it seem to them all like exile? Oh, to be passing anonymously through an impersonal landscape? Oh, not to know every stump and stone, not to remember how the fields of Queen Anne's lace figured in the childish happiness they had offered to their father's hopes. God bless them. And he says at one point, the father does, why do they always want to leave? Why don't they want to stay? And so there's that tension, the beauty of it, and yet, gotta get out of here. Gotta find one of my own. Near the end of the novel, after Jack has fled for the last time, the Black woman and her son show up at the house. They've heard so much about from Jack. They've shown up too late to meet him. And Glory is so glad to see them. She's just, Jack. Oh, Jack has spoken of you. Yeah, Jack has told us all about this house. And they have this wonderful conversation on the porch. And Glory welcomes them in. And the mother says, we can't. We have to get back to, I think it's Missouri, before nightfall. It's not safe for us to travel. And so their being in this all-white Gilead, Iowa town is dangerous. And that's home too. And that's why Jack can't be there. And so the complexity of home comes through in countless novels. Are there others that come to mind for you? Where home is just so complex. We've named a lot of them. Okay. So there's a third kind of literary homesickness. And this one's more spiritual. And this is where I thought I'd go when I first agreed to do this talk about literary homesickness. But it's the kind of homesickness that everyone, homeless or home rich, like me or you, where we have not one home, but we have this church home. And maybe there are other homes that communities you're part of. But it's that that longing for a home that no earthly home can satisfy. That writers like C.S. Lewis and Frederick Buechner talk about often. We have a home. It's not quite enough. There's something, we're longing for something else. And maybe this is very familiar to you, but it's a chapter from C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, also written, I think, in 1943. It's a chapter on hope, and I can't read the whole chapter, but what I did is just to sort of summarize the argument through quotations throughout the chapter. I first read this, I think, in college. I have handouts, sorry. But it always stuck with me, this idea that we're never truly at home. But I love what Lewis does with it. And I don't know how familiar you are with this, so let's just read through. In fact, I'll just read through it with you. These are the highlights of the chapter. If you read history, you will find that the Christians who did most for the present world were just those who thought most about the next. It is since Christians have largely ceased to think about the other world that they become so ineffective in this one. Aim at heaven, and you'll get earth thrown in. Aim at earth, and you'll get neither. Most of us find it very difficult to want heaven at all, except insofar as heaven means meeting again our friends who have died. One reason for this difficulty is that we have not been trained. Our whole education tends to fix our minds in this world. Another reason is that when the real want for heaven is present in us, we do not recognize it. And he says this, the longings which arise in us when we first fall in love, or first think of some foreign country, or first take up some subject that excites us, are longings which no marriage, no travel, no learning can really satisfy. I'll just emphasize here, C.S. Lewis is still a bachelor at this point. And his examples reflect that, I think, often. There was something we grasped at in that first moment of longing which just fades away in the reality. I think everyone knows what I mean. The Christian says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exist. A baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there's such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire, and I add, he might have included women in this too. Well, there's such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in the world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably every earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. If that's so, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for the something else of which they are only a kind of copy or echo or mirage. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of life to press on to that other country and to help others to do the same. And so our longing for home here, he says, is never truly met because we're meant for a true home, a true country somewhere else. And I love it as sort of a proof of heaven. That has been a great comfort to me in my life, that yearning has a fulfillment. And that yearning, if the fulfillment is not here on earth, well, then it's somewhere else. And C.S. Lewis is smart enough and wise enough for me to hang on to that. And I take it as sort of a proof of heaven. It even inspired me to write a couple of poems, heaven poems, I call them. Jeff, you want to read the short one there? Fox News. I knew Jeff knew this. Fox News is less about politics and more about my aversion to technology. Sorry, Marge. And I'm so grateful for those who know technology, but it's never been a strong point of mine. And in heaven, I think might be a little different. Fox News.
For the people at home, and they hear to hear. He hopes in heaven, natural things become natural again. His laptop will be the spot his granddaughter Sylvie sits, and FaceTime will be them in the rocker, sans Wi-Fi and screen. Kindle will warm into a verb again. Apple, an adjective for fresh pie. In heaven, it shall be law. Birds, not presidents, tweet. And the only Fox News of the day will be the 4 spring kits in the grove out back, unfair and unbalanced, as they dash and romp in a slant of evening sun, their new coats lit red.
Cindy and I would, in our first few years at Timber Ridge, great place, by the way. The movies told us that, and we moved there. We'd sit out back after dinner, and we'd just watch these foxes play. And, they were maybe 50 yards away, but it was just such a joy. And so I'd say to Cindy, Fox News, and we'd go out on the porch and watch. Even then. Yeah. And then another one, since I have time, it appears, and then we'll wrap it up with a Buechner point. But many mansions. Like a lot of you, I grew up with a pretty awful view of what heaven was going to be like. And Lewis even talks about that in his chapter here on longing for heaven. I thought it was going to be a lot like a Sunday afternoon. And I hated Sunday afternoons. And I think a lot of us did because of all the things you couldn't do. And so my view of heaven has become one of more delight. And so here's many mansions. He hopes houses in heaven have old back doors, wooden ones with a rusty screen torn a bit, maybe to be a secret entrance for June bugs and moths invited by the porch bulb. And if it's not too much to ask, may the door be a deep forest green like the one he resurrected on sawhorses in the driveway this morning. Sun filtering through maples, blessing the breeze. The door glued and clamped and painted fresh again for a summer of creaking spring and hinge and hallelujah, where Jesus leans into a neighbor's back entryway, sets a basket full of sugar snap peas on the pine floor right alongside a mess of flip-flops, then sneaks away to the holy bump of wood on wood, the soft amen of click. And so Lewis says that's what we're really longing for with home, that home beyond our home. And Buechner picks that up as well in a book, not surprisingly, titled The Longing for Home. In the whole first essay, he talks about his grandmother's home, the various homes he and his wife have lived in Vermont, and just questioning the whole idea of home and what it means. And he ends with this, and I'll end with this too. He says, and he's talking about being called a saint by other people and how uncomfortable that makes him. But he says this, in my books and sometimes even in real life, I have it in me at my best to be a saint to other people. And by saint, I mean life giver, someone who's able to bear to others something of the Holy Spirit, whom the creeds describe as the Lord and giver of life. Sometimes, by the grace of God, I have it in me to be Christ to other people. And so, of course, have we all, the life-giving, life-saving, and healing power to be saints, to be Christs, maybe at rare moments even to ourselves. I believe that it is when that power is alive in me and through me that I come closest to being truly home. Come closest to finding or being found by that holiness that I may have glimpsed in the charity and justice and order and peace of the other homes I have known, but that in its fullness was always missing. I cannot claim that I have found the home I long for every day of my life, not by a long shot. But I believe that in my heart, I have found and have maybe always known the way that leads to it. I believe that George Buttrick was right, and that the home we all long for and belong to is finally where Christ is. I believe that home is Christ's kingdom, which exists both within us and among us as we wend our prodigal ways through the world in search of it. That nice? That's the real home that we're longing for. Not sure of many novels that illustrate that. Does Buechner in any of his novels? Godric? Yeah, probably all of them. I think you're right. I think you're right. Thank you, folks. Been a pleasure to be here. Thanks for listening.
If I could have the volume one more time. One announcement is that next week, Dan Rooks will be leading us in a session as a psychologist, helping us talk across the political divide. There's going to be an election the Tuesday following that. And more than that, Thanksgiving is coming. So we thought this would be very timely for next week. So thanks again, Mark. Thank you all for being here this morning.